Good evening and welcome. I'm Rhonda Haynes, and it is my privilege to serve as Executive Director of the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues, also known as NODL. For the second year, we are excited to present I Resolve, a public debate series launched last fall with the goal of engaging high school debaters in real conversation about criminal justice reform in their communities. During tonight's program, students from the Silicon Valley Urban Debate League will discuss the 1033 program, which allows for the transfer of excess military equipment to police forces. Students will bring to light the ways that access to this equipment for police officers impacts the communities they are sworn to protect. Supporting this important discussion between students, esteemed experts, and interested parties are our generous 2021 I Resolve financial sponsors. I want to take a moment to acknowledge, with personal appreciation, series sponsor Jennifer Wade and sponsors Davis, Wright, Tremaine, and Massey and Gale. Thank you all for your commitment to the conversation and for making these events possible. In 2020, Human Rights Watch sent a letter to the Congressional Armed Services Committee urging them to end the 1033 program. In that letter, they wrote, "Research studies indicate that the 1033 program is not only unsafe, but ineffective as it fails to reduce crime or improve police safety." The program came to national attention after the aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. In the aftermath of Ferguson, law enforcement agencies across the country have continued to receive military equipment and weapons of war, including mine-resistant vehicles, body armor, rifles, and at least 76 aircraft. Tonight, students from Silicon Valley weigh in with well-developed arguments that explore the impact that increasing police militarization has in their communities, as well as the reform options available now that this equipment is present in their police departments. After the debaters' initial arguments, our guest panelists will offer commentary on these arguments, providing both perspective and feedback for the students to consider before their final summation of their cases. I am now pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. I present to you Stuart Singer, partner, Boy Schiller Flexner, NODL board chair, and passionate champion of civil rights and debater at heart. I consider it a privilege to work closely with Stuart and I'm very pleased to have him share with us this evening. Thank you. Stuart?
Thank you, Rhonda, very much. And I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors and to thank our debaters for participating in tonight's event. Debate has always held a very special place in my life. I think of debate as the reason I'm able to really practice law now. And I went to what would be an urban debate league school in Miami, and debate made a transformative effect on my life and set me on a path to law. And I think that for many of our debaters, it's had a similar effect throughout the country. And so I have been very proud and privileged to serve as chair of the NAUDL for the last several years and to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I think that debate is more important than ever before because we're living in a time when people are not listening to one another. And what debate teaches is that it's important to listen to one another. You learn through debate that there are two sides to every story, two sides to every case. And so I think it's particularly important in an era where people tend to only listen to their own echo chambers, that we have a opportunity through debate, especially through a series like the I Resolve series, to talk about important public issues. And certainly discussing criminal justice reform in the particular areas here is exactly what we should be doing. Now, debate is something which has helped students throughout the country. And I'd like to just say a few words about the National Association for Urban Debate League and our various leagues throughout the country. There's around 10 to 11,000 students who have participated each year We are fortunate to have peer-reviewed research which shows that participation in debate lends itself to and causes better educational results in terms of test scores, graduation from high school, matriculation to college. And in addition, debate offers a community, people who learn that they have a voice, that they can speak up and express their views, and they learn how to connect evidence with arguments so that it's not about emotion, it's not about pounding a table, it's about making rational arguments. Something from time to time, perhaps some of the people in Washington should listen to. So I'm very glad that everyone tonight is here participating in this edition of I Resolve. And thank you very much for being part of the debate community. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to Roland from the Silicon Valley Urban Debate League. And again, thank you very much for putting on tonight's debate.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you, Rhonda, the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues, and all of our sponsors for really elevating and supporting this critical conversation. We really appreciate everyone being here tonight. So the Silicon Valley Urban Debate League, which we affectionately call SVUDL, trains young people by teaching them effective communication and advocacy skills and providing them with opportunities to compete in speech and debate tournaments throughout the year. Our students are more than 90% students of color and are overwhelmingly from low-income backgrounds. And as Stuart shared, the very skills our students are developing in speech and debate are needed now more than ever, particularly to advocate for change. So to that end, we are thrilled to be back for our second year to kick off NAUDL's I Resolve series, which continues its focus on critical issues within criminal justice reform. As Rhonda mentioned, our students today are going to be debating the 1033 program. First, we're going to hear from Castella Nuen, who is a senior at Yerba Buena High School, and she will be presenting her plan to end the 1033 program. She will be followed by Eric Zaragoza, a junior at Andrew Hill High School, who will instead present ideas to reform the program rather than abolish it altogether. They'll not only have opportunities to ask each other questions about their respective plans, but they'll also receive feedback and questions and comments from our distinguished panelists as well. So without further ado, I pass it along to Castella for her first speech.
Hello, my name is Castella Nuen. I'm a senior from Yerba Buena High School, and before I begin, I'd like to thank the Silicon Valley Urban Debate League, the National Association of Urban Debate Leagues, and everyone else who is joining us tonight. Without you, this event would not be possible, so thank you for allowing me to talk about something that I care deeply about. Now, let me set the scene. When the U.S. Marines patrolled Afghanistan, our troops wore desert camouflage to blend in with their surroundings. They carried rifles to attack enemies and drove armored vehicles to ward off bombs. It was clear that our troops were on the offensive against unknown enemies in Afghanistan. But why is the same gear being used in cities back home in America? For this, we look to the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in 2014. An unarmed 18-year-old was shot and killed by the police in a story that is sadly familiar to many young people of color. Protesters filled the streets of Ferguson, Missouri in outrage. Harrowing images showed police forces descending on demonstrations, dressed in army camouflage and helmets as they wielded attack dogs and drove armed tanks. They fired tear gas and rubber bullets at crowds who held their empty arms in the air with a simple but pleading message: hands up, don't shoot. As Congressional Representative Emanuel Cleaver put it, Ferguson resembles Fallujah more than it does Ferguson. But this is not a war zone. This is America. The militarization of police departments has been a feature of U.S. domestic law enforcement since 9/11. The 1033 program has funneled billions of dollars to law enforcement to acquire military-grade weapons. Everything from bayonets to grenade launchers to tank-like vehicles have proliferated nationwide, creating war-like scenarios instead of traditional police action. With racial injustices becoming more apparent, it is imperative that our nation stands behind a system of equality and freedom. Despite that, our police are looking and acting more like occupying soldiers in our cities, rather than officers tasked with protecting and serving its residents. This not only contributes to racialized violence, but also harms innocent civilians. Thus, I advocate for the abolition of the 1033 program. While my opponent may argue for great changes to reform the program, it is necessary to combat the source of the problem. Otherwise, it is impossible to create tangible change and prevent injustices from happening in the future. This would help for two reasons. First, while there is a legitimate reason for police to keep peace, there should be a difference between police and military responses. Washington has incentivized the militarization of local police precincts by using federal dollars to help build small armies. Military hardware not only makes civilian cops look more like soldiers, it makes them more likely to act like soldiers too. According to the ACLU, there is no evidence that this program has made communities any safer. If anything, the program forces departments to deploy equipment at least once a year in order to keep it, which has created a culture in which citizens are perceived as the enemy, implying that the police are at war with its communities. The result is unnecessary escalation and violence within communities. Secondly, the consequence of this militarized police mentality can be deadly, especially for people of color. A study by the AJPH found that on average, police kill 2.8 men every day in the US. The risk of death is 3.5 times higher for Black men compared to white men. With this in mind, it is clear that the 1033 program can be implicated in troubling police violence despite the difficulty of tracing the deployment of specific weapons. We can look to the protests of June 2020, for example, which began in response to the murder of George Floyd and racial justice. Crowds were met by police in riot gears and volleys of tear gas, flashbangs and non-lethal but painful sponge rounds, and rubber bullets like what happened in Ferguson 7 years ago. Clearly, Ferguson was not an outlier, but an endless cycle of violence that would continue as long as this program exists. In conclusion, it is clear that action must be taken against this extreme militarization that is happening to our police departments. The distinction between soldiers and police officers must be widened. Otherwise, we risk creating violent militias out of the people who have sworn to protect us. These militias risk harming everyone, especially our Black and brown communities, who are already disproportionately affected by police violence. Thus, the 1033 program must be abolished. Thank you.
Hi, Castella. Thank you. I will now begin cross-examination. Abolishing the 1033 program can put a financial burden on cities that have relied on the gear provided by the program. Is there a solution to the economic burden cutting this program would potentially put on cities?
I think that a majority of the weapons that are currently being funneled from the military to the police have already been subsidized by taxpayers' dollars, which is why it's already free for the police departments and they only really have to pay for shipping. And an alternative solution could be grants, for example, that like the Department of Justice currently offers grants to police departments in order to buy equipment, to pay police officers, and to acquire training for the newer officers that join the team. So I don't think that this will cause a big financial burden on anyone, really.
Thank you. You note that gear law enforcement agencies are provided with is a significant contributor to police violence, but aren't there other more damaging practices that pose a greater threat to the community? Let me give you an example. So might a misbehaving officer hurt the community more than the gear that you give them?
Thank you for that question, Eric. I think that there are definitely other damaging practices, but that does not excuse the harm that has happened through the 1033 program. Just because like there are other things such as like systematic racism, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take away these weapons. Because while my action doesn't stop the system of racism, it stops one avenue in which these racist like people or people who are like abusing these weapons can like be stopped. Because someone who is racist will only like be more harmful, especially when they're given these really big militarized weapons that they probably shouldn't have in the first place.
Thank you. You state everything from bayonets to grenade launchers to tank-like vehicles have proliferated nationwide, creating warlike scenarios instead of traditional police action. Can you sort of clarify what traditional police action looks like prior to the 1033 program?
Of course. Thank you for that question. So specifically, we can look towards the Reagan era with the war on drugs, where this is probably one of the first examples of the militarization of police. This was seen through police receiving things such as armored vehicles from Reagan to fund his war on drugs and eventually the war on terror. And prior to that, it could be expected that a police officer holds like a handgun and not much else. And even though this system might not be perfect previously, there was more communication and less escalation instead of like the military grade weapons that they have right now. But to me, I think that it's not a question of what it looked like before, but what is happening right now to our communities. So we probably shouldn't solely focus on like what it was like before the 1033 program.
Thank you. So I will now begin my advocacy for the reforms. So hello, my name is Eric Saragosa. I'm a junior at Andrew Hill High School, and I am pleased to be able to represent the Silicon Valley Urban Debate League today. I would like to thank SVUDL for allowing me to develop into a more confident speaker and introducing me into the world of debate and speech, and NODL for giving me a platform to speak. Additionally, I would like to thank the community leaders in advance for their invaluable feedback. In our nation's most recent time of crisis, we were so quick to respond to change. We were quarantined, wore masks, and stopped speaking face-to-face, sometimes even with our closest family members. All of this happened within a matter of weeks. But often, when something has been so inexplicably wrong in the policies and procedures governing day-to-day life, it takes years to make even the smallest change. Police, a symbol for safety and community, have often served as a polar opposite of that in American cities. After all of the instances of police brutality in our nation's recent history, no child of color today can reasonably be asked to accept that an officer brandishing weapons is a symbol for safety, unless there is community oversight of the policies and procedures of police. The 1033 program was created to funnel military-grade weapons and equipment from the hands of the U.S. Armed Forces to law enforcement agencies as a way to reuse already purchased equipment. I believe the premise of this idea in the abstract is well-intentioned and may well represent an effective cost-saving measure. However, the way it has been implemented has led to abuses of power, contributed to the militarization of police, and has also continuously lacked the oversight or accountability of local and state governments. Therefore, the 1033 program should be substantially reformed. Throughout my case, I will be using the example of Salt Lake City as a model for the types of reforms that would be ideal in cities like San Jose and across the nation. The 1033 program is crucial in outfitting police to deal with events where military-grade surplus is necessary. The 1033 program takes away a financial burden from taxpayers to outfit police with weapons that would be acquired anyways. An evaluation of the Department of Defense's excess property program states that officials at larger law enforcement agencies indicated that they would still have obtained most of the controlled and uncontrolled items through other sources, such as grants. This ensures that in the event that military-grade gear is warranted to be deployed, the police and other departments are ready to respond to such an event. While my opponent may argue that extremes like terrorist attacks are not all that likely, there have been multiple situations where this gear has been deployed. SWAT is dispatched to approximately 50 operations a year in Salt Lake City. Outside of officer safety, it is important to consider the balance that is fundamental in the equation for public safety. While it may be argued that officers having military-grade weapons in the first place endangers the safety of innocent people, consider the reason there is a necessity for officers to carry any weapon in the first place. The stark reality is that making weapons illegal will not remove gun violence, similar to how removing the 1033 program will not remove military-grade weapons from the hands of police. It may be true that the creation of the program blurred the line between military and police, and so therefore, heavy oversight and reform should be implemented into the 1033 program. Limitations of what gear police receive should be strengthened, and reform should be modeled after what is currently proposed in Salt Lake City, but go even further to ensure public accountability. Legislation is already being introduced to limit the types of equipment Salt Lake City police can obtain through the 1033 program. This legislation bars police from using city funds to purchase military-grade equipment. As mentioned before, there's nothing stopping police from using the 1033 program or grants to acquire these weapons. The most radical thing this ordinance would do is have police department explain in writing to the city director of finance, the mayor's office, and the city council the need for such gear. This includes explaining the specific purpose behind the gear or weapons. At least one public hearing will be held for each request, where the council reaches the decision to suggest what the police department should do. If the department disregards the decision, it is required to once again identify the use of gear or weapons. This is where radical change needs to be implemented. After jumping through all these hoops of bureaucracy, the city director of finance, the mayor's office, city council, and the public council meeting reached the consensus that the gear should not be accepted, that decision should remain final, not be a mere suggestion. Implementing reforms like this, not only in San Jose, but in cities across America, would create real change. Suggestions are what lead to tanks roaming around cities. Final decisions are what create real tangible change. I say we start implementing this change in our communities today.
Thank you so much for a wonderful speech, Eric. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Sounds good. So first moving on to my first question. You talk about a system of oversight being used in Salt Lake City. Has this already been implemented?
So oversight was proposed in Salt Lake City in September of 2020 and is yet to be acted on. But I think it's important to remember that the reforms that I'm proposing are modeled on this ordinance and actually go beyond what the original ordinance proposes, which is just a mere suggestion, while my plan is proposing action.
So there hasn't been any data on whether or not this type of oversight has worked before?
No.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to my next question. On June 6th of 2020, the Oakland police stopped a 22-year-old Eric Salgado for a traffic stop, then shot his vehicle over 40 times. Salgado was killed, and his girlfriend, who was 4 months pregnant, was also shot and injured. Given that Salt Lake City has a very white population compared to other parts of the country, such as Oakland as highlighted, why is this system applicable to these places, where stark examples of police brutality often occur?
So it's outside of my knowledge if the Oakland police use weapons or gear provided to them by the 1033 program, but the implementation of my reforms would make it so that the people of Oakland could prevent these weapons and gear getting to the hands of police in the first place. And I think you touch on the issue of police brutality, which is specifically hinting towards the fact that the police might be the problem, and the police will harm communities because of lack of training or whatever the reason may be, regardless of the weaponry they're equipped with.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, it's really difficult to see how conservative parts of the country would have councils that would limit or restrict the 1033 program. Those are often the places where minority rights to protest are at highest risk. Isn't it necessary to have the federal government end the program rather than leaving it up to local governments to decide how to administer it?
So when you have the federal government implementing reforms, I think it's important to note that the federal government is more likely to fall prey to corporate lobbying and special interest and things of the sort. And secondly, I think the federal government is good for implementing universal oversight, for ensuring uniformity. And when you do that, you say that you want X weapons to go to X county because they exceed the population threshold, and therefore they should get this gear. So the federal government might be good for implementing reforms like that, but having the state and the down to the county level take care of what gear and equipment should be given to the police department makes it so that it's tailored to their specific community and not be a mere, population threshold by the federal government.
I see. Thank you, and I think that's time.
Thank you both, Castella and Eric. There is so much to unpack there. I really appreciate you articulating your respective opinions. And so thankfully, we have an amazing panel who will have an opportunity to ask you all questions and help you unpack it further as you prepare for your final speeches. So our first panelist is Mr. Sgt Khan, who serves as the Santa Clara County Deputy Public Defender. A South Bay native and civil rights advocate, Sajid is the son of Muslim immigrants from India and was born and raised in Silicon Valley. He received his undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley and his law degree from UC Hastings. He's worked for the last 13 years as a deputy public defender in San Jose. Our second panelist is Sgt Dustin Davis from the Santa Clara County Office of the Sheriff, an office he has served for nearly 25 years. He is currently the Mutual Aid Coordinator of the Search and Rescue and Air Support Unit and is also a public safety bomb technician. He received his undergraduate degree from San Jose State University. And last but not least, we have Judge Jesus Valencia. Judge Valencia is a judge of the Superior Court of Santa Clara County and currently works in the Felony Trials Division. He completed his undergraduate studies also at San Jose State University and earned his law degree from Santa Clara University. I shall note that the Judicial Code of Ethics and Canons for a judge on the Superior Court of Santa Clara County requires him to remain neutral on questions and issues that he may one day have to adjudicate on in the courtroom. So, however, he does look forward to asking questions in a nonpartisan nature to our students to help clarify and support their positions. So thank you all so much for being here today. And with that, I'll first pass it off to Mr. Khan to open up questioning to our students.
All right, thank you all for having me, and thank you for this opportunity to listen to both of you and to ask you some follow-up questions. So I'm going to start with Ms. Nguyen. If we were to abolish the 1033 program, what would police officers from our respective cities do in scenarios of a mass uprising or an uprising in our communities where a critical number of people are armed with weapons or other safety threats? What would your proposal or policy do to ensure that police officers are equipped to meet the demands of that type of scenario?
Thank you so much for that question, Mr. Khan. I think that While the 1033 program does give a lot of those weapons that have been used for like massive uprisings, as you've mentioned, I think that there are alternative things that they could purchase outside of the program, because even if we do not get rid of the entire 1033 program, it's been shown through like the Obama reforms previously that even if we ban specific types of weapons that the police aren't able to get, it shows that they've still been funneled into the programs somehow, which shows that one, we not only need to end it, but that there are other means in which they could get the gear. So even like let's say they might not get Kevlar helmets or other types of like body armor, there's still things that are specifically made for the police to use in order to go against these types of threats. So I think that those weapons could still be in circulation to be purchased outside of the 1033 program.
Thank you. I have one more question for you, Ms. Nguyen, before I turn to Mr. Zaragoza. So what about the idea that the use or the possession of these types of gear and other paraphernalia by our police departments, that they have the impact of deterring crime from happening in the first place? Are people knowing that the police are equipped with this type of equipment are deterred from committing crimes that would incur the response of police officers with that equipment?
So I think that this question is like very complex, and I think that a lot of arguments for the 1033 program are for deterrence to help deter crime. But as shown through studies from the Human Rights Watch, as mentioned by Rhonda, or even the ACLU, it's shown that this hasn't really made communities any safer or caused crime to go down in any means. And if anything, it's shown to cause safety to go like down even more, because when police have these types of weapons and the types of training that comes with it, it causes like situations to be more escalatory because they have these weapons that are meant to go against these big events when it's not necessary. For example, many like police forces get these weapons and end up going to like houses to check on people with SWAT gear and other things that probably aren't super necessary. So I don't think that they necessarily deter harm, or deter crime, but I think that they cause situations to escalate because people are uncomfortable with gear being used inappropriately or in such scenarios that aren't really necessary.
Thank you. And I'll ask one question of Mr. Zaragoza. After the killing of George Floyd last summer, I think you would agree that there was a palpable call in our community for a transformation of policing across our county and across the country, specifically the premise that we should be reallocating funds away from our police departments or from investments in the types of equipment that we're discussing towards other systems that actually help us prevent crime from occurring in the first place. Wouldn't abolishing the 1033 program be answering the call from our community to in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's actually very important to make that distinction, because really what my reforms open the door to is community activists and community leaders to come and say, hey, actually, we shouldn't be granting the police department with these type of weapons. And that opens the door for the reallocation of funds, as was proposed after the killing of George Floyd. And so really my reforms, rather than give weapons to police and regulate how many weapons they're getting, they're based on a community basis. So if you're in a community where, frankly, it is necessary to have some of this equipment to safely patrol the streets of your community, that's down to the community level and the county level. And that's a decision that can be made there.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you both. I'll turn it to back to the group or to our sergeant. Oh, Sergeant Davis. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sgt Davis. Thank you for letting me participate in your guys' event today. I only had a couple questions. I'll start with Ms. Nguyen. Do you actually know which items on the 1033 program are prohibited in the system?
So I don't know comprehensively, but as mentioned by Rhonda, and like on the top of my head, I know Kevlar helmets, also certain armored vehicles. I think the ones that are like one track, not the ones with wheels, but the ones similar to tanks, are also banned. Bayonets are also prohibited as well. I'm not completely sure about the rest.
Okay. And then, do you actually know, or do you have any idea, or is there a mechanism that you're aware of, where we're able to actually check for our region how many 1033 assets we have, how much those assets are worth, and if we've actually saved any tax people or taxpayers money by going through the program?
So currently, if you check the 1033 program or like the LESO website, they open source how many weapons and what types of weapons are being sent to different counties. Well, they don't cite the specific departments. They do tell you the types of weapons, how much, and the quantity of them. So we're able to have that information, although it's not super accessible if you don't like look for it for a while. As for taxpayers' dollars, specifically, the program was enacted or at least implemented to save money for police during the beginning of it. I don't remember the specific year, but it claimed to save taxpayers' dollars. And yes, I do know that to a certain extent they are subsidized by taxpayers, but I'm not sure how much money it has saved.
Thank you. And then for Eric, I have very similar questions. If you've actually know what the dollar amounts look like, and if you've been able to locate any services or resources online to talk about the weapons that are banned and how much money or taxpayers money we've been able to save.
Yeah, so on the topic of taxpayer money, I think the 1033 program is a very feasible way to save taxpayer money because, as you know, the taxpayers would be the ones that have to end up paying for the equipment that we give to police currently, right? So by reusing equipment, we're obviously saving money there. As for the second part of your question, the specific figures would be determined by the people in the city council and the community members and the community activists, and would be run by the city director of finance to provide an estimate of what would be needed to keep and what needs to go, and what can be introduced into the police department. I'm sure there is a database for the types of equipment that is going to be introduced to the program or is currently on hand by the law enforcement agencies, but I do believe there needs to be a more substantial database with more information about where these weapons are going and what they're currently being used in. Because I am sure, and I did read that there has been some weapons that have gone missing, or there has been weapons that have been acquired through the 1033 program to actually sell and acquire monetary funds for the police departments that can be applied to other things. And part of my reforms would be to end doing things like that.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
All right, I guess I'm next here, so I'll go ahead and step up. And again, thank you to the program sponsors and certainly to the organizers of the event for inviting me and the opportunity to participate in this really important, I think, educational opportunity for both you and myself. I'm genuine about that because I think you have an opportunity to learn, but you also have an opportunity to teach in many of these instances. So I'll begin. I'll ask my questions first to Ms. Nguyen, since she was the first to speak against the 1033 program. So my first question really has to do with, an observation that, we live in a much more challenging times in terms of what police are asked to respond to. There are armed insurrections against governments and branches of government. There's organized crime. There's civil disobedience, all of which I think have demonstrated that our law enforcement agencies are significantly outgunned and overwhelmed with the lack of resources to respond to these type of civic civil unrest events. So my question in that context is, why shouldn't law enforcement be able to take advantage of the assets and resources that's being offered through the 1033 program to sort of put themselves in a position where they're better able to respond to these events and organized protests, so that they can better do their job to protect and preserve the public safety?
Thank you so much for your question, Judge Valencia. So I think that the 1033 program, while in theory is a really good idea, has shown to be in execution not so great. And this is for many reasons. Well, I think that you are right, that there are a lot of insurrections and different things that are occurring. It's shown that, one, those events haven't occurred as much as the abuses that have been done against people of color within communities where especially police brutality has been very apparent. And that even though the police aren't super funded in a lot of ways, I think that some of these events should not be dealt with by the police, because these are people who have sworn to protect communities and keep them safe. But we might need to push it towards another agency instead, with either the SWAT team or the National Guard. And that's shown where the lines have blurred, because we've become so dependent upon the police in order to become militarized and protect against all these big threats that it's become to the point where communities are these people that they think are causing these insurrections, causing more violence. So I think that your question touches onto a deeper question of whether or not the police should be doing that in the first place, which is why the 1033 program and its abolishment would be a step in the right direction to move away from the police having to deal with that and having other agencies do that instead.
So just a brief follow-up question, because a lot of the events that law enforcement is called upon to respond in times of civil protests or disagreement with issues such as the George Floyd Black Lives Don't Matter protests in San Jose, but they were also in Portland and Washington and across the nations. And it seems to me a lot of communities of color where these protests took place, business districts were vandalized and looted, and those minority businesses suffered the brunt of these impacts, and police in many instances were helpless to respond and protect property and life in that scenario. So doesn't denying the resources of the 1033 program impact the ability of law enforcement to better protect those members of the people of the community, of people of color and their businesses as well?
Thank you for that question. I think that while it is true that we're taking away a lot of weapons by abolishing the program, as I've told Mr. Khan, I think that there are other ways in which they can acquire equipment that is appropriate for the police. Things such as armored vehicles that they get right now, where they're able to put machine guns on top, and other types of weapons are not as necessary with dealing with everyday policing, or even in those areas instead. And I think that they're still able to acquire the equipment that is necessary through grants. They're just not able to get it in access as seen through the 1033 program, that not only funnels this equipment if they pay for the shipping, but demands that police deploy it at least once a year. And that I think that these negatives outweigh the potentiality of protecting these business owners, when especially they are not super impacted when we're able to give police resources through other means, such as grants under the Department of Justice.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nguyen. So I have a couple of questions for Mr. Zaragoza. You mentioned that the structure of the 1033, the regulatory structure of 1033, promotes and advocates civilian oversight, government regulation, and monitoring by expenditure of funds, and those sort of traditional governmental interventions. But isn't it true that for example, is something as local as the independent police auditors here in San Jose, and similar regulations in different neighboring states. Those kind of efforts by the public to intervene and monitor and provide civilian oversight over police has not been very effective. And there isn't really a model that shows that oversight of police, oversight of acquisition of these sort of very lethal weapons and equipment can really be effectively regulated by local or state governments.
Thank you. Judge, I think you hit the nail right on the head. And I think the ordinance that were being proposed in Salt Lake City were mere suggestions. They would be ordinances that the people would speak, and then they would make a suggestion to the police department. And then if this police department decides that they don't want to run with that suggestion, that's completely okay. And that's what they would do, and they would end up acquiring these weapons anyways. What my reforms plan to do is to actually give a voice to the people, and within reason in local government, establish whether or not the law enforcement agencies should end up receiving these weapons funneled to them through the 1033 program, rather than just being a mere suggestion. My plan is dependent on the fact that, there would be actual change and action going on, rather than a suggestion that can easily be ignored and overlooked.
Well, thank you. So let me ask a related question, because we were talking about the likelihood that there would be an economic benefit to the taxpayer, because they're not having to expand money to get equipment that they can get ostensibly for free if they are granted that option. But the truth of the matter is that most of the equipment that they need may not be something that they can acquire through that, because there are limitations and regulations on the equipment that is available to them. So the heavy duty armor and other crowd control vehicles is something that taxpayers might have to pay just the same. But my point is this: is why not take funds that are available and put those into other alternatives to equipping police with more firepower, if you will, and put those into programs that de-escalate, teach and training in de-escalation, more community policing that emphasizes contact with the community as opposed to conflict with the community. What is your thought on that?
Thank you. And I think it's very easy to interpret my reforms as a possible conflict with community, while rather I think it's important to look at it in a way that it's working with the community. So what we would end up with is a plan that is based at the county level. So if the county decides that, we've tried taking away these weapons from the police, and it actually has been worse for our communities. There's been a rise in crime, and the police don't have the means necessary to police and keep these communities safe, then they would be able to make that distinction, regardless at what cost to the taxpayers. But keeping the program itself would make it easier, even if for not all, but some weapons and gear to be acquired to the police without having taxpayer expenditure.
Thank you. And thank you again for allowing me to ask some of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists for all of those questions. They were outstanding. My name is Sarah Sanchez. I am the Director of Programs and Communications at the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues. And we have a brief interlude here in our debate while our debaters are going to prepare their final speeches. They have not written them yet. They will each come back in about 10 minutes with a 3-minute summary of their arguments and why they believe you should still vote for them, even with what they have just learned from our esteemed panelists. However, in the interim, I get a chance to get to know our panelists better. And so I just have a couple of small questions for each of you. Mr. Khan, I will start with you. As a public defender, I'm sure you encounter argument and advocacy, critical thinking skills, and research every single day. How do you think our debaters did at demonstrating those skills as they show up in your line of work?
I thought they did a tremendous job. I thought both of them were clear. They both were concise. They both were prepared with data as well as persuasive arguments. And they very much comported with what I would desire to see from an advocate in the courtroom.
Myself as well, although I've not spent much time in courtrooms. Sergeant Davis, I imagine that these skills show up in your job in different ways. I'm curious, the same question. How do you think our debaters did demonstrating the types of skills that make for a successful sergeant?
I think they did a great job. Most of our job is a little more on the fly, so we don't really get a lot of time to prepare. So having the gift of gab and being reactive to your situation is super important. I think they did a great job during the questionings. They did a very good job like interacting with all of our questions, with all the panelists. I was super impressed with their knowledge on a lot of the program. I think they did wonderful.
Thank you so much for that. Judge Valencia, I'm going to ask the same question to you, but I also have to say your questions were quite challenging. We've worked on these cases for a while now, and I thought our debaters did a nice job holding up under some challenging questioning here, but I'm curious how you think they did under that questioning and how you think their skills showed up today and how that would play in your courtroom.
Well, I hope I wasn't too rough on them, but frankly, I agree with the comments of Mr. Khan and Sergeant Davis. These young people are obviously remarkably well prepared. They know the issues and are versed in the facts, and those are the things that when I have litigators come before me, I look to see how well do they know the facts, how well do they know the law, and how well do they think on their feet? Because as much preparation as one does, one has to always have an intuition to be able to think on the fly and come up with articulable, reasonable responses, and they've done that. I think they're really well prepared, and sometimes the questions that I pose as a judge is a little different than I would pose as an opposing counsel, because I need to have them help me think outside the box for solutions, and sometimes I look at things in that with that lens, and I think these two young people here demonstrated that well, that they can think quickly on their feet and not lose focus, get back on track.
Both you and Sergeant Davis has spoken to the need to be adaptable, to improvise in situations. I think that's such a critical part of training for so many positions, even when we don't think of them. And Judge Valencia, I'd like to just return to you for 1 second. What is it specifically about debate and that Socratic process where you get to ask people questions about the arguments that they've just presented, sort of probe a little bit to see how deep their research goes, how deep their understanding of the issue goes, that is really helpful for developing advocacy and for developing those speaking skills?
Well, frankly, to me, there's two things. First of all, it builds confidence in your critical thinking, because it's twofold. You have to be able to analyze and engage in critical thinking very quickly, but the thinking is only one component. The other part is to articulate that thought process and have it come across being persuasive to your particular point of view. Because in the final analysis, when you're advocating for something, you want to win over your audience. You want to win over the people who are at the recipients of the information. And so all of those things I think are what the goal of debating is, to me, is to make you a much more effective advocate and proponent for whatever position you're trying to advance.
I really appreciate that answer. And I mean, I use the improvisational skills that I gained through my time in debate almost every day when I'm approached with a situation or something that I hadn't encountered, and I have to think about it on the fly, apply a bunch of knowledge that I have in my head and make it applicable to a new situation. Sgt. Davis, I imagine that you do that under incredible pressure all of the time. And I would love to hear a little bit more from you on the improvisational skills that you see in our debaters and what impressed you.
I think that showed most during the questioning process, right? Because they're not able to forecast what kind of questions we're going to propose to them. So they kind of have to have a really solid breadth of knowledge, how they're going to answer that question, and kind of have an idea of how they're going to make that question fit their point when they answer it. So I think it's super important that they clearly, they listen to the question and they're able to kind of brief back the question and their answer a little bit, and then make it count what they want to try to establish at the end of the conversation. And I like how they both did it. They both did an expert job on it. They'd be great out on the street, working a street cop at some point and figuring out how to interact with the community and talk to everybody. They both did a wonderful job. I'm very impressed.
That's awesome. We think about the communication skills that you have to have in the law and the courtroom, but the communication skills that you have to have out on the street are also incredible, and the stakes are in some ways a lot more immediate and a lot higher. So I very much appreciate that from you, Sgt. Davis. Mr. Khan, the same question in terms of thinking quick on your feet, being able to adapt, and what you saw from our debaters in that question and answer period that might have impressed you.
Yeah, there are very few courtroom processes where you are kind of permitted to just speak without interruption or without having to respond to things that are likely to be unanticipated. For example, whether you're picking a jury, cross-examining a witness, arguing a motion before a judge, we will, as advocates, always be derailed, for lack of a better term, by unexpected answers or questions. And so it's really critical that advocates develop the muscle and the aptitude and the courage to respond in real time to things that are spontaneous and unexpected, something a prospective juror might say that we didn't anticipate, or something a judge might ask that we hadn't necessarily prepped in our notes, or something a witness might say that was not in a police report or not in a witness statement. And so that ability to go with the flow and improvise and think quickly on one's feet, but also be willing to kind of stay calm under that pressure is really critical. And I thought that the advocates tonight did a really good job of that. Especially, I think I noticed, like, they each took, rather than just launching into answering questions, they each took a beat, they took a breath, they kind of gathered their thoughts and then answered. And that pause is really critical as an advocate, as opposed to just speaking hastily. And so I was impressed by that.
I could not agree more. And I am so excited to hear what they do with the time that they've had to prepare while we have been talking. I am going to ask, actually, that our panelists leave the stage right now. We are going to go back to our debaters. I believe Castella is ready with her final speech for the night. And so I'm going to turn the stage back to Castella and to Eric, and then our panelists will be back at the end with some final feedback for our debaters after these final 3-minute speeches. Castella, the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And hello, everyone. I will begin now. Looking at America today, it is not much different than what it was like 7 years ago in Ferguson, Missouri. When we think of George Floyd and the protests last summer, we don't just think of the tragedy that struck our nation as yet another innocent Black man was murdered by the police, but the acts of violence being brought down against protesters calling for action. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and militarized vehicles wreaked havoc on our streets, even though years have passed. Our nation is a war zone. The 1033 program has heavily militarized our police program since its creation. It has not only funneled millions of dollars of military weapons into local police departments, but ideologies of militarization. They are not just police, but soldiers who are told to fight against the war on drugs, the war on crime, and eventually the war on terror. If all leaders are telling our officers to fight this war, it has a psychological effect that has caused police to lash out against communities, especially people of color disproportionately. Despite any claims of increased safety, studies from the ACLU prove that it has only caused more harm than not. While Eric makes a great case for reform, it simply is not enough. It's like putting a bandage on a stab wound. Over time, the real damage will begin to bleed through. What works in Salt Lake City, a city with a mainly white demographic, may not work across the United States. In cities such as Ferguson or even Oakland, we see the difference in racial demographics. When we hear about police brutality, we don't think about headlines from Salt Lake City, but places with predominantly people of color. For example, referring to a study done by the AJPH, Black men are 3.5 times more likely to be killed by police than compared to white men. It is clear that the relationship between police and populations are simply different, as innocent Black and brown bodies are murdered time and time again. While his plan is in good faith, any reforms would not go far enough, especially in light of the racism we see today. I think that it's important to acknowledge the points that our panelists brought up. It is true that policing is becoming more dangerous, but this does not justify having more violence against communities as well. While there are other avenues for police to acquire weapons to deal with such threats, ones that are not as militarized and heavy duty to deal with everyday citizens, what we can't get back is the endless amount of lives that have been taken as a result of this heavy militarization of the police. The money doesn't nearly matter as much as the lives of innocent people. The 1033 program has brought harm and violence upon our people as the police have turned America into a war zone. It is clear that the lines have been blurred between our military and police. Those who have sworn to protect us have begun to work against us, especially those who have tried to exercise their right to protest. This isn't a war on drugs or a war on terror, but a war against freedom for those who are exercising their rights. Thus, I urge you to support the abolishment of the 1033 program. Thank you.
The federal government is sitting on a surplus of weapons and gear, and the decision to abolish the reuse of this equipment would limit the safety of these officers and ultimately the safety of the community. Put in the context of our current world, rising crime rates and taking the equipment of police do not combine. SWAT is dispatched to approximately 50 operations a year in cities like Salt Lake City. There is a very real need for this equipment in some communities, but abolishing 1033 would put in jeopardy some of this much needed gear. Like much of these panelists brought up, the first thing that comes to mind when you think about abolishing 1033 is, what about the firepower? What do we do when there are insurrections, as one panelist brought up? While Castella argued for a wonderful reform and made an excellent case as to why 1033 should be abolished, this question still lingers. Castella makes an important note in using specific examples like Ferguson, Missouri. And the beauty of the Democratic plan is that it allows for the same protesters in Ferguson to have a say in the gear the police in Ferguson are getting. Ultimately, the arguments are put up to an ultimatum. How are we protecting the community versus how much power are we giving to the law enforcement agencies and the officers themselves? The truth is we can regulate both. Both of these can be resolved when you give power to the people. That being said, using Salt Lake City as a world is ideal for getting a point across, but I would be lying if I said that it's a perfect representation of America. I want to highlight the essence of democracy in my plan. Like in any place, no two cities are the same. Salt Lake City is an outlier in ethnic diversity. But because my plan relies on the fundamental principle of democracy, we see community oversight across the board and across the nation. In a world where elected officials are elected on the merit of their work and their impact on society, diversity is going to be found in these communities. My reform tackles the problem that I believe we currently have, being that law enforcement agencies have a unanimous say over the weapons and gear that they get. As mentioned before, officials at larger law enforcement agencies indicated that they would still have obtained most of the controlled and uncontrolled items through other sources, such as grants. This legislation bars police from using city funds to purchase military-grade equipment, as well as regulate the equipment they will receive overall. It would be wrong to assume that implementing this reform would jeopardize the safety of the communities. Who else better to understand the needs of the city than its own population? This reform goes beyond taking away unneeded weaponry from the police. It gives community activists a platform to speak on, a way to create real change in their communities. It educates the public about situations a police officer might encounter while policing the city, and why certain gear is important in handling such situations. Above all, the reforms are transparent. Things change, and they will continue to change for the rest of the time. It's an unavoidable fact. So implementing legislation that changes with the needs of the people is imperative for a safety a safe and trusting community. Each state and county is different, and we must appeal to the needs of the people first, a principle that the police department are trusted to employ. The fact of the matter is we can live in a world where police officers' safety simultaneously is not jeopardized by the safety of an innocent bystander. While superficially, taking away the guns from the bad guys seems like a solution that fits a circle in a cylinder, we have a multi-angled, asymmetrical shape that needs a solution tailored by the needs of the people.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Nguyen and Mr. Zaragoza, for your eloquence and your advocacy. I just want to say it takes a lot of courage to do what both of you did this evening, to take the stage and bear of yourself in the ways that you both did. I really applaud you both for that strength. I also want to note, you ultimately both probably spoke for 15 minutes in total, but I can imagine that there were probably hours of preparation that went into these 15 minutes of advocacy in terms of research and practice. And so I acknowledge all of that work that went into tonight. I really appreciated all of your respective points. Ms. Nguyen, I liked your response in your final summation about Salt Lake City being somewhat exceptional relative to other cities like Oakland, where there are people of color. And I really appreciated your use of data throughout your presentation on safety and the lack of evidence that these types of this type of military equipment actually makes our community safer, as well as the disparities on race that you cited. And then, Mr. Zaragoza, I really appreciated your nuance, your ability to not acquiesce, but to kind of concede on certain points, but then focus on your greater point about maintaining this program while seeking to reform it. So I thought it gave you significant credibility in your approach. And I appreciated your arguments and advocacy as well. Last thing I'll say is that in the opening comments, I know you guys are on a clock, but you both had a tendency to speak really fast, and I can completely understand why, because of the clock and just because of the need to get your to get all of this dense information out there. But overall, I thought you both were excellent. And again, I really applaud your courage and your strength and your willingness to show up, and then all the preparation and time that you put in. And then lastly, because we're still in the midst of this pandemic, to do this on a computer screen from wherever you are is much harder to do than doing it in an open courtroom where you can see like a judge, or you can see a jury, or see an audience. Having that sort of human interaction can be so helpful in advocacy like this. So for your ability to do this from behind a screen and without seeing like human beings nodding or giving affirming or maybe even non-affirming responses is really even all the more impressive. So thanks so much. I will pass it to Sgt. Davis.
Thank you. I thought you both did an excellent job. Your knowledge and passion in this topic is very apparent. I liked how Ms. Nguyen talked about how the money isn't really the important piece. It's the trust of the community and building bridges with the community. And I really like Eric's comparison with Salt Lake City, even though it is just a very basic framework at this point, but it kind of opens the door to a lot of different nuances that this program could go in. I think I work a little bit with the 1050 program here in the Bay Area. We are not super active in this program. We're fortunate enough to where we have funds and grants and other places to secure money and equipment. But I think where this program is important, that we kind of need to remember, is all the communities that don't have money. We're talking all the communities in the South and the Midwest, and a lot of those communities that qualify for that grant money that we keep referring to are part of like UASI regions and Shush Gap regions, which are both very important Homeland Security grant streams that most of those regions don't qualify them for. And some of those grant programs don't even exist in some of the states, where they may not be able to pick up an armored vehicle or something. And the other piece about the 1033 program is you got to think of it like a garage sale. Everything that the military is getting rid of, they've already used it up and they're giving it off to the civilians to use. So you might have a county out in the middle of nowhere that can't afford $500,000 to get an armored car. So they might have to use that weird anti-tank or anti-landmine vehicle or some weird tracked vehicle. It's not the best choice, but let's say they have an active shooter in their community or something where they might need to deploy that vehicle. Here in our county, we've had 4 active shooters in my career that I've responded to, and there's been armored vehicles at every single one of them. And I'm not sure how we would respond to incidents like that in today's day and age without them. These incidents are growing more common, they're more complex. You look at like Route 66 shooting, you look at like the Pulse nightclub shooting, you look at the fault line shooting, all of these events just happening to everyday people out doing everyday things. And without some of that equipment, they wouldn't have been able to go in there and get it, right? Go in there and be able to mitigate some of those problems or evac some of those civilians even. So I think it's important to remember which communities this program is serving. It'd be kind of cool if we could locate like a demographic or a statistic that talks about what communities are really capitalizing and using this program. I know for our agency, we have like one item from the 1033 program. That's a camouflage net that's hanging up over the barbecue pit at the range that I've been trying to give back to the program for a couple of years now because it's kind of pointless. So it's an interesting thing to think about in our community, right? We have 5 armored vehicles in our county. Each one of those armored vehicles is about $500,000. All of those vehicles were paid for either by police department's budgets or through a UASI grant stream, which we have the luxury to even access. But none of them are through the 1033 program. Some other things I'd like to think about for both of you while you're unpacking this argument. It's kind of hard to remove some of that language about police reform from the 1033 program, but at the end of the day, the 1033 program is just a purchasing mechanism. It's just a place to go get stuff. And it's kind of incumbent on law enforcement and us to make the changes on how we use that stuff and how we work with the community and how we work with the judicial system, how we work with the people on how we use it, how we deploy it. Military grade weapons and heavy duty weapons don't really exist. It's rifles and pistols. There's no rocket launchers. Grenade launchers haven't been part of the program since like 1999. And even though they're called grenade launchers, they were always used to launch smoke or CS and stuff that you'd see in the riot control and stuff that came up a lot in today's conversation. And those are all important things. And when we look at like crowd control and riot control from the days of like Ferguson to like the days of Derek Chauvin, night and day difference on like the response, especially here in the Bay Area and Oakland and San Jose. Like the first night the Chauvin riots broke out, there was a lot of gas deployed, but within days it changed night and day. A lot of changes happened overnight that are going to be affecting the future, and I think we need to look at some of those when we're talking about like response to like civil unrest and how much of that equipment really comes from the 1033 program. Like I said, we're pretty lucky to have enough money around here to buy that stuff, but when it happens in other places like Ferguson, it looks totally different. And the other piece on the armored vehicles is I've never really seen an armored vehicle used in everyday patrol. I've never seen it really deployed like in a situation where you get a regular call for service and then like your patrol officer will ride up in an urban suburban. Never seen that happen. It's something we need to think about is like how we're going to unpack the way the 1033 program looks and how we're going to present our arguments. Both of you had a lot of charged language about like what we're actually getting out of the program. And I would argue that places like California and here it's Bay Area, maybe even in LA region, we don't really get a lot out of it. But places like Ferguson or maybe other areas in like some more rural communities, they probably get a little more out of it, but there's always going to be another way to get stuff. But like I said, you guys really made great arguments. I was so impressed during this entire process. And I love to hear what both of you said. You both have really great ideas for the future. And I can't wait for you guys to be in charge and kind of mold our communities and take us what direction we're going to go from here. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I appreciate it.
All right, so it's back to me, and I'll again start with comments to Ms. Nguyen. It's clear to me that you're very passionate about this issue, and that's a big plus because that's a big motivator, and you focused on the right things in trying to deliver your persuasive point of view on these issues. I threw a big brick at you with the issues of insurrections and armed insurrections at that, organized crime, civil disobedience, all of the big hot button issues, and because those are the things that are kind of the big obstacles in your trying to convince people that listen, notwithstanding all of these negative things that are happening in the world, arming our civilian police with military grade equipment is not the solution. And so I think you sort of did a good job getting back to that focal point. And so that's important that you're able to sort of catch these different arguments that are coming at you, field them, and then respond with your own counterpoints. And I think you did that. Your summation hit all the points I think that were vital and important, and they were to the point. And Mr. Zaragoza, you likewise I think are very passionate about your position. The I think thing that stands out to me in your delivery was Mr. Khan mentioned it in his comments, is you have this knack for accepting the things that you cannot change and that are obvious. So that's a talent to concede a point. I'm not prepared. I don't have that knowledge immediately, but that doesn't sort of put a stop to your argument, because you sort of naturally segued into your counterpoint, and that I think is very, very important to debate. So you just continue to develop that skill, maintain that skill, develop it. But I'll be brief to a comment to the two of you that I think should be helpful. I hope is helpful. Is you're under a lot of pressure and a lot of time constraints and restraints, and so you have to develop your argument pretty quickly on the fly. So what I suggest is, because what you ended up doing in your final response is you ended up reading a lot of your material back, and it's a lot of material to read back. And unfortunately, it's a disadvantage when you have so much to say and so little time. I would suggest that you develop your point discussions and responses so that when you see a bullet point, you know what you're going to say. So you should have 5, no more than 6 bullet points to get you back on point, and try to read less and articulate more, because again, it's a question of persuasion, and you want to persuade people to your point of view. And if people are seeing that you are reading, that's really kind of a distraction, because they are in a hurry to listen as opposed to being patient to understand. And so focus on that, and I think you're going to be much more effective debaters and advocates in the final analysis. So I commend you for everything that you've done. You're very well prepared, and you're going to be better at your craft as you practice and develop. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to Stuart and Rhonda, Sarah, Luke, the whole team at NODL, and all of our sponsors for hosting the series of public debates. it's just critical conversations that need to happen, and so appreciate the opportunity to give air to it. We're just simply honored to be a part of the series. Thank you to Judge Valencia, Mr. Khan, and Sgt Davis for spending time with our students this evening and sharing your perspectives, sharing your questions, and so appreciate you all. And last and certainly but not least, please join me again in congratulating and virtually thanking Castella and Eric for diving in and debating today. For all of you in the audience who are our current SVUDL community members, thank you for your continued support. For those of you who are learning about SVUDL for the first time this evening, please visit our website and learn more about our amazing students and programming. We have the privilege and honor of working with folks like Castella and Eric every day, and so we would love for you all to get to know them. To that end, whether you want to volunteer for us at a future tournament and judge some rounds of competition, or even make a financial contribution to support our mission, check us out on our website. For those of you in the audience who are speech and debate competitors, please take a look at our upcoming John Lewis SVUDL Invitational, which will be from November 19th to the 21st. We'd love to have you join us. We already have over 1,100 students registered nationwide. So again, visit our website at www.svudl.org to learn more. Thank you all so much for attending this evening, and have a wonderful night. Take care.